All right, welcome again. Our yearly pre-VBS Father's Day celebration. Today, as you would expect, I have a little different type of sermon, so we will take a break from 1 Corinthians and consider another portion of Scripture, and that can be found in Genesis chapter 4. Now, I only have one verse, couple of verses, but one primary verse that will be projected there in front of you, but we will consider other verses within that context of the book of Genesis. How's the energy level? Yeah. I need an energy drink. All right. Genesis chapter 4. Now, before we actually get to this primary verse, let's just think about the context of the story within the book of Genesis. We know about the creation of everything, including humanity. We know the fact that Adam and Eve fell, and thereafter, if we follow the narrative, if we follow the story, we get to the point where Adam and Eve, they have children. First they have Cain, and then they have Abel. Now, we continue the story, and something tragic happens. Again, this is after the fall, so sin is introduced in a very applicable, tangible way. So these children of Adam and Eve, they are literally born into sin. And there is a point where both of these children, they are offering things to God. Abel's offering is deemed acceptable. Cain's offering is deemed less than acceptable. He has this fit of rage and jealousy and slays his brother. If you go through the narrative, after God establishes the consequences of that act pertaining to Cain, there is a part of the story that establishes the fact that Adam and Eve went ahead and had another child. That child named Seth. Now let's pause for a second and consider everything that I have just mentioned here, specifically with regards to Adam and Eve's children. We have Cain, we have Abel, who is no more, and then we have Seth. Basically, if you look through Genesis, the second half of chapter 4 is the story of the descendants of Cain. If you get to the very end of chapter 4, you will start getting the story of the descendants of Seth, and then throughout chapter 5, that story of the descendants of Seth continues. Now we get to the point in my sermon here, in our meditation, that we have to think a little bit between the lines and do a little bit of speculation, but it's very profitable speculation because it'll make things make sense. So here you have Adam and Eve, and now Adam and Eve, up till the beginning of chapter 5, they only have 2 kids. Well, there should be an issue with that. If you just think about, again, the history, the narrative of humanity's history as it is being told and unfolded, there should be certain issues. Because if we read that just as a thorough chronology of events, there are gaps of time that should be filled with other things. But fact of the matter is, when Moses, most likely Moses, when he was writing this account, his thought process, his goal was not to make a thorough and complete account of human history. It was very much topical. He was very selective with regards to who he chose to highlight as he was narrating these events. So all of that to say that it is very likely that between Cain and Abel and then Seth, other children were born from Adam and Eve. Now, why do I say this? This part is not speculation at all. The fact that Adam and Eve had other children, it's actually part of the biblical account. Because if you do have your Bibles, and this verse is not going to be projected, but I'll go ahead and read it to you. On chapter 5, verse 4, it says this. Actually, I'll start from chapter 5, verse 3. And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. So we know for a fact, based on biblical account, that Adam and Eve had Cain, Abel, who perished, Seth, but also other sons and daughters who were not named. Now, question, why weren't these sons and daughters of Adam and Eve named? Why weren't they named? Simply put, because they were not important. They were the proverbial middle children. Who cares? Who cares? Doesn't matter. You're a middle child. You shall remain nameless. You pick and choose the important children to establish this narrative, and everyone else remains nameless, because the point that Moses was trying to make here was a parallel between Cain, who symbolized this fallen humanity, but then this other line that would be used for the salvation of humanity. Everyone else is insignificant, even though they existed. So this is pretty much a fact, right? It is biblical truth. It is part of the account. Now, we get to a point where we start speculating a little bit, but it's still within an area of possibility, if not probability. It is very likely that between Cain and Abel and Seth, other children were born. Now, if you read this verse that I just read, especially verse 4, but I'll read it again. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. It almost seems like Moses is saying, look, Cain and Abel, and then once Adam was 130 years, Seth was born. And then after Seth, for 800 years, Adam and Eve had a bunch of other kids. It kind of seems like this is what Moses is saying. And it can be true, but it's not necessarily true, based on how it's read here in English or the original. Now, read it this way, and this is another way for you to read it to try to make sense of what Moses is saying. I will read it again, and again, you will follow, but I will add words to this text, and hopefully God won't smite me or throw a thunder or lightning bolt, but you will see why I'm adding this. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and by the way, he had other sons and daughters. Do you see the difference? If you add, by the way, the narrative changes. Because basically the intent of Moses was to say, look, there was Cain and Abel, there was Seth. But also there were other kids, by the way, who shall remain nameless, because again, they are not important, but they were there. Now let's back up for a second. We know from this text right here that Adam lived till he was 930 years, correct? 130 till Seth, 800 more. Add those two together, 930 years. Essentially, Adam lived about 10 times longer than we live today. Now, if we extrapolate that pertaining to fertility, and how long a woman remains fertile and is able to have kids, that's roughly from 30 to 35 years. Times 10, 350 years just based on normal biology. And here I'm not even putting into account the fact that they lived in a world that was much more perfect, for lack of a better way to explain it. So that could have extended beyond. So at a minimum, Eve could have kids for around 350 years. At a minimum. Think about that, ladies. 350 years. Now put that to the side for a second. And now go back in time a little bit more. When the story is told in a more simplistic way regarding the creation of man, chapter 1 just kind of gives an overview. Chapter 2 goes into greater detail. But in chapter 1, when God establishes, or Moses establishes the creation of Adam and Eve, essentially humanity, look at what he says on verse 27 of Genesis chapter 1. Again, this is just a general overview, and then he will go into greater detail in chapter 2. But in chapter 1, verse 27, he says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created." And then on verse 28, it says, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish, over the sea, over the birds of the air, and over everything living things that moves on the earth.'" Man and woman, they were created. They were created for a purpose. God gave them a job, 2 jobs essentially. Have dominion over all other created things, and fill the earth. Procreate. Would it make sense for Adam and Eve to be created? And again, when they were created as adults, and then they had this blessed challenge given to them: procreate. The other part of their duties to have dominion over all the created animals and beasts and whatever, that was kind of hindered by the fall. Remember, everything got kind of messed up. They still could do that a little bit, but the procreation was still a must because God wanted to fill the earth with his image. Would it make sense for Adam and Eve to be created? Again, as adults, they don't have to wait very long to have kids. Have Cain, have Abel, very likely right away, because, come on, you have one job to do. Right? You have one job to do. Get to it, Cain and Abel. And then wait 100 years to finally have another child. Does that make sense? It could happen, but does that really make sense? No. So again, it is very likely that chapter 5, verse 4 is a by the way that Moses is adding here. He's saying, look, between Cain and Abel and Seth, by the way, Adam and Eve had many other kids. But I'm picking Seth, and I'm also establishing this line of Cain as a parallel. These 2 lines are going to be symbolic of something, even though many other kids of Adam and Eve were born in between. Not only that, but it also makes sense, something that Cain himself said after God corrected or disciplined him. If you remember the narrative, after Cain killed his brother, God, pulled Cain to the side and said, "Dude, where's your bro? Where'd he go?" And Cain said what every son, teenager says when his father asks him something. "I don't know. I have no idea. Am I my brother's keeper? But then it was clear. Why? Because the earth itself, the blood was shed, and the earth itself was a witness to the slaying of Abel. And God established punishment, discipline, correction. Essentially, Cain was to roam the earth, and he would have a very hard time planting things and cultivating things. And then there comes a point when Cain is thinking about this punishment. And he utters this weird thing here. So he says on verse 13 of chapter 4, and Cain says to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. Now, if Adam and Eve did not bear any other children between Cain and Abel and Seth, who is Cain talking about? There will be no one else around to kill him. So again, it makes sense, even though it's not literally included in the biblical account, that Adam and Eve had many other kids between these two lines. And now we get to the point where we have this text. Chapter 4, verse 26. As I mentioned, prior to this, in Genesis chapter 4, Moses lists the family tree of Cain. And then before ending chapter 4, on verse 25 and 26, now Moses is introducing the family tree of Seth. So on 25 of chapter 4, and I'll start from the verse prior to 26, it says, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God had appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. And then it says, then men begin to call on the name of the Lord. Now, we don't know how this happened. We don't know why this happened. But just based on, critical thinking and reverse engineering, if now, starting from Seth and beyond, men start calling on the name of the Lord, what does that mean? It means that prior to that, they did not. We're yet, before, if we backtrack all the way to the very beginning, there wasn't even a need for man to call on the name of the Lord. Why? Because God was always available. He was actually the one who was always reaching out. If you think about what happened when the fall occurred, did Adam go searching for God, asking for forgiveness? It literally states there that God searched and called out Adam and asked, where are you? And a similar thing happened with Cain. He went and he called out to Cain and said, where is your brother? But again, God was always around. He was roaming around the garden, always available, always there. There was no need for him to be called because he was just there. But between that and now Cain, that period of time was a time depicted by distance. For whatever reason, God was not available anymore, or as available, and humanity, quite frankly, did not care, did not miss him. It wasn't a thing, to the point where wickedness started to arise and thrive. And all of these sons and daughters of Adam and Eve more and more distant from God, or distancing themselves. But then again, we don't know how, we don't know why, but it happened. Finally, Adam and Eve had a son, a child, that broke the mold, that broke the pattern of distance. This is actually the very first time that this expression is utilized in the Bible. But there are other times where thereafter it will be said, it will be talked about, this idea of calling on the name of the Lord. But again, Seth broke this pattern. Apparently, Adam and Eve finally had that seed that was promised after the fall that would somehow crush the serpent's head. Again, after trial and error, Abel was gone, Cain was wicked, and quite probably every other child that they had before Seth was rotten, was not fit to be the seed, the promised seed of the woman that would crush the devil's head. And then what happened? What occurred? In Genesis chapter 6 and 7, the line of Seth remained, and every other son and daughter of Adam and Eve perished in the flood. And it was almost like God was saying through Moses, I was waiting. I was waiting for this son of Adam and Eve to be born. And through them, or through him and his descendants, this is how I'm going to redeem humanity. But it all started with Seth. It all started with Seth. So what's my point here? Why am I highlighting this? Again, this verse that states, then men began to call on the name of the Lord. Why is this important? Well, there's this quote, I think it was by Warren Buffett, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously the context of why he said these words had nothing to do with what we're considering here, but this truth still remains. He said this, and I quote verbatim, "Someone sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago." Again, someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago. This has to do with forward thinking. This has to do with doing things today that may not really make sense or will not really have fruit or evidence, but you're doing it not so much for today, but actually for tomorrow. And quite often, you're doing it for the benefit of those who are to come and not your own. Whoever has planted a tree, in Ramona especially, knows this. It takes a very long time. But if you do have trees in your lots, in your homes, and you are blessed by that shade, who do you have to thank? Your real estate agent, partly, but mostly those who planted that. And maybe they didn't even get to enjoy that shade, but you do. And the story of humanity depicted within these first few chapters of Genesis is a depiction primarily of people who could care less or couldn't care less about those who came after. It was a depiction of people who wanted things for themselves, for their selfish reasons, immediately. But here came Seth. In some way and somehow, he had this vision and he had this purpose. And he did something that literally stimulated humanity to call on the name of the Lord. Something that benefited him, but mostly benefited those who came after him. Look what it says in Genesis chapter 12. If we fast forward through history, to time, eventually Seth's line leads to Noah. We all know what happened with the flood. Everybody perished except that family. And then we move on to the next great character, which is Abraham. And when Abram, in chapter 12, was called out of his family's home, he listened, he obeyed, and he went. And then when he arrived in a general location, which seemingly was the location that God wanted him to go to, it says here on chapter 12 of Genesis, on verse 8, and he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west of Ai, on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Do you know what this is called? Shade. Shade of righteousness. The tree that was planted long time ago. Abraham was able, was capable to call on the name of the Lord because that was planted. And we can fast forward even more. We can go all the way to the New Testament. We can go to Romans. Romans chapter 10, verse 13. And there we see Paul utter these words. And what words does Paul utter? He says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Shade. The shade that we all have a privilege to be under. The shade of the possibility of salvation. The shade of the availability of God, who when called upon by faith will save. That shade was made available by the decision of this man way back then that broke the pattern of unrighteousness, of sinfulness, of pride, ego, and planted this tree of righteousness. So what's the motivation? What's the example that we are here meditating upon and hopefully strive to follow? Dads, men, parents in general. Plant those trees. May not make sense right now. No evidence of that may come right away. You may have many other better things that you could do with your time, more enjoyable things, things that make more sense. Plant those trees nonetheless. The shade that that tree will provide may be a catalyst, for salvation and righteousness for generations to come. You may not even see it. You may not witness it firsthand. Seth, I'm sure, had no idea how his decision would literally affect all of humanity. Nevertheless, he did something. He decided something that changed the course of history through his line. Maybe in a smaller scale, yet very much significant. We can strive to do the same. Plant those trees so the shade can be taken advantage of, enjoyed for years to come. Amen.